Over the course of world history, history itself has been defined by how people move around the globe, traversing land bridges that once linked continents, sailing on primitive ships, fleeing famines. That is not just history, of course, it's also today. Millions of people are on the move around the globe and again changing the world as we know it. Over the next 2 episodes, we're talking about those population shifts, where people are coming from and where they're going. This is After the Fact from the Pew Charitable Trusts. I'm Dan LeDuc. One of the world's largest cities to experience dramatic demographic changes is London. A recent study from the Center for London, an independent think tank there, reveals something about how that city is changing. 70% of children now born in London have at least one foreign-born parent. And that's our data point. 7 in 10 children born in London have a parent who wasn't. What's occurring in London is in some ways a microcosm of migration trends around the globe. To learn more about that bigger picture, we sat down with Mark Hugo Lopez, Director of Global Migration and Demography Research at the Pew Research Center. As we mentioned, the data point for this episode is that 70% of the babies born in London have at least one foreign-born parent. The world is a really changing place right now. People are moving and migration is happening. What you do tracks that. What's the big picture in global migration right now?
So worldwide, about 3.3% of the world's population is an immigrant. Now that's actually slightly up from, say, the 1960s when it was about 2.7% who were an immigrant. But the number is reaching new highs every year. We're now at about 255 million people worldwide as of 2017 who are living in a country in which they were not born. So this is a worldwide phenomena. Largely, though, I would say a phenomena of a few countries. You should know the United States, for example, has, of that 250 plus million, 45 million live in the United States. So that's the single largest population of immigrants anywhere in the world. But in the case of the UK is actually one of the world's leading destinations for migrants. It's in the top 5 of countries worldwide in terms of the number of people, more than 3 million, who are born in another country. So in many respects, London's experience reflects that large foreign-born population that lives in the UK. If you take a look at the world migrant flows today, where are the big migration corridors? So where are they today? The biggest ones, of course, are the Middle East to Europe. There continues to be a flow of people, although it's significantly reduced in recent years as Europe has struck deals to slow the flow. Also from Africa to Europe, that's another big migrant flow. Within the Americas, Mexico used to be the world's biggest corridor of people moving. Now, actually, to the United States, within the Americas, you see people coming from Central America, and we've heard a lot in the news about unaccompanied minors or families crossing the border in the last summer, for example. So you have a lot of people coming from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, also from Cuba, and Venezuela, which has had an economic meltdown. And as a result, there's a lot of people who have left Venezuela, many of whom have come to the United States to seek asylum. So the U.S., in terms of big arrows coming to the U.S. from Latin America, Mexico less so, Central America, Venezuela, and Cuba more so, which is, I think, interesting. On top of that, the U.S. attracts people from around the world with a big flow coming from annually, in fact, bigger than Mexico, from India and
more from India.
China. In fact, those are the 2 leading countries of new arrivals in the United States, and that's been the case for about 5 years now. So Mexico is no longer the leading sender of people to the U.S. It's actually Asian countries now. So you talk about all these flows. Those are just some examples of where you have some of these big arrows. But Africa and the Middle East are the 2 places that are sending people the most worldwide at the moment.
Sub-Saharan Africa. That seems to be poised to become the really one of the really dominant places that we need to watch as a people sort of outflow. What was some of the data that you've been exploring? What are some of the signs we should be looking for? This
is a big question among policymakers in Europe. Who and how many might come from Africa, and will Europe be their destination? In some of the surveys that we've done, we've asked migrants in countries like Ghana, for example, and Tanzania, Senegal, and South Africa, and Kenya, and Nigeria. If you had the means and opportunity to do so, would you leave your country for another country? And we found, for example, in Ghana, 75% of Ghana adults say that yes, they would leave if they had the means and opportunity to do so. We also asked, would you do it in the next 5 years? And we found that in Ghana, again, about 45%, almost half, said that they would or they plan to leave sometime in the next 5 years. You ask where they want to go. What's your top destination? And we found that the United States is often the top destination, followed by Europe, and then, of course, many other places in the world. But the U.S. and Europe are the two top destinations.
Our country, the United States, is always been viewed as a country of immigrants. We can look back at waves in history here, whether it's the Irish or the Germans. Where does what's going on now fit in historically like that in terms of numbers and impact?
So the U.S. has had large waves of migrants before. For example, in the mid-19th century, it was largely an Irish and a German wave of migration of maybe about 14 million people. The migration wave that we're currently in the United States, it started in 1965 when the U.S. changed its immigration law and created the current system that we have. Since then, about 59 million people have come to the U.S. Now, the U.S. is a much bigger country today in terms of population, and migrants make up about 13.7% of the U.S. population, according to the most recent statistics from the Census Bureau from 2017. That puts us not at a record, but approaching a record. And the record was set in 1890 when we hit almost 15% of the U.S. population foreign-born. So in terms of the share of the U.S. population, we're not at historic numbers yet, though we're very close. In terms of the number of people living in the U.S. as immigrants, we've never had as many as we have now.
It's just a lot of people.
It's a lot of people. It's a big country.
Yeah. You have thanks to this great job, you have global perch, right? You get to look back and see. What are you going to watch? What are the trends that you're most closely watching, say, over the next 2 decades that most of us are going to live through and see some impact from?
There are many trends that are worth looking at and keeping an eye on. The first, of course, is the big questions about who are and where will the big sources of new migrants be. That seems to be Africa and the Middle East that are the two most poised, partly because of demographics and high fertility rates and relatively young populations. I think also, though, there's many questions to be asked about international policy. How are countries going to address migration? Are they going to continue to want to attract migrants? And how will they attract migrants? Think about Japan. In the case of Japan, the Japanese government has opened the door some to migration, allowing workers to come in through various programs. And keep in mind that it has an aging population and it has a demographic challenge, yet many of those workers are not allowed to bring their families. So Japan has opened the door some to immigration, but hasn't opened the door entirely like the United States, say, or like the UK. So how countries respond is another big trend I think that's worth considering. Finally, I think is the question about what happens to these migrant populations in the countries where they settle. Will we see a story of integration, a story of people intermarrying and their children essentially becoming part of those countries in a way that we've tended to see here in the United States? The second generation, the children born here, for example, tend to do better than their immigrant parents. Or will we see a story that's somewhat different, where integration doesn't happen successfully and the subsequent generations born in a country where the parents or grandparents migrated to have limited opportunities and perhaps don't even learn the language of that new destination country like their parents may have. So they may be in Germany, for example, and not really learn German, but instead continue to speak Turkish. So these questions of integration, I think, and trends are ones that are worth keeping an eye on because there's so many migrants around the world.
You know, some of the major cities in the world are just growing amazingly. How are the migrants contributing to this renaissance that we're seeing in so many cities like New York and London and elsewhere?
Migrants are a big part of the story for growth in cities everywhere, and not just international migrants, but internal migrants too. So in the case of London, for example, that's an international city. That's attracting migrants from around the world, people of many different talents who are coming to London to pursue careers. New York is another city that's drawn a worldwide population of people who have talents who can succeed in a place like New York. Same thing with Silicon Valley in the United States. But internally, there are also many people who are moving to cities as well. So the migration story is not just about cross-border, but it's really to cities. And China is really, when we think about internal migration, there are more internal migrants, according to the United Nations, in China than there are international migrants worldwide. So
you're talking about the folks in the rural areas of China being attracted to the major cities. That
correct.
Movement
is bigger, more than 250 million people, than the number of international migrants in the world. Cities are really the attraction here because that's where jobs are and opportunities are. But also many cities are struggling to deal with an influx of migrants. Cities in Latin America, for example, like Mexico City, have a hard time with infrastructure, providing water, for example, for many parts of the city where people have built barrios or shanties. You have a similar problem in many parts of Asia as well. So while it is a world in motion, and cities like London have benefited greatly, other cities are struggling to cope with the number of people moving into those cities. More than half of the world's population today lives in cities, but that's a relatively recent development. We used to have most of the world's population just 50 years ago living outside of cities. So urban spaces have become the place where the majority of the human population lives, and it's really recent migration, a lot of it in China, a lot of it in Africa, a lot of it, of course, in the West as well, where people have moved to cities to pursue opportunities, to pursue jobs, to pursue careers, and so forth. So that really does give you some sense of the perspective of a world in motion, which is really what this is. It's more than just about international border.
In our next episode, we're headed to a city in motion, London, and we'll take you on a tour through the vibrant neighborhood of Brixton with Ben Rogers, director of the Center for London.
London's changed actually in a way which I think has even taken the experts, the demographers, by surprise. And I remember when we had the last census in 2010, it transpired that the proportion of white British people in London was now less than 50%, which no one was expecting.
Pew has other resources on global migration. The latest edition of our Trust magazine features an article on the emerging sub-Saharan exodus that is sending millions of Africans to Western Europe and the United States. And you can read Pew Research Center reports on the topic too. All that and more are on our website at pewtrust.org/afterthefact. If you like what you hear, help us out by leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for listening. For the Pew Charitable Trusts, I'm Dan LeDuc, and this is After the Fact.